But I've been rewatching all Du Plessis fights, and I want to talk about like what makes him effective. I'm going to unlock the. Well, I mean, you will have read it anyway. The post-fight breakdown of Du Plessis Whitaker, which I thought had some really interesting reads from Du Plessis. And one of the things that is fascinating about him is that after a fight, in the interview in the cage, when he's probably been hit in the head and might have a concussion, he still says like what they saw in the camp and what he was working towards. And I kind of appreciate that honesty, because a lot of fighters are still pretty secretive of what they've seen in an opponent, just because there's the chance that you'll have to rematch them at some point. And certainly they don't talk about it in the post-fight. Sometimes you'll hear some guys say, oh, we spotted that, if they score the knockout off it. But Du Plessis has been pretty cool about like telling people what they worked towards about these fighters that he's just beaten. But that's the thing, like, post-fight Du Plessis sounds like he's an elite technician. And then you see the fight and you're like, oh my God, what's going on? His hands are all over the place, his chin's up in the air. But you know that the charging flurries are a thing that Du Plessis does. He does these, like, pumping his hands and running straight in with his chin up. And it helps that he has a crazy chin, because if you watch the Tavares fight, Tavares just drops and throws the overhand every time that Du Plessis comes in, and he dings him hard the first few, and it doesn't seem to affect Du Plessis that much. But there are two things that sort of help him fight like this. One is that I'm going to look up his reach now, because I believe he has a very long reach from what I've seen. And he has a 76-inch reach on 6'1" frame. That doesn't sound that long. But you do get heavyweights with like 72-inch reaches and 74-inch reaches. So. But he does this thing where he throws these... He pumps the punches going forward and catches guys with a long straight punch when they think they're out of range. And I think a lot of that is to do with like him leading with his right hand from orthodox and then stepping through with his left hand. And, you know, the shifting left hand has always been pretty effective in MMA for covering distance. But then the other thing is that like he'll charge people down, and when they stop and drop a punch in his face or they try and counter, they do like Trevin Giles tried to pull counter on him. He pulled from the first punch, tried to slip the second punch in as Du Plessis ran onto it. Du Plessis just ran into him like a freight train. He went chest to chest, and I think he banged heads with Trevin Giles and opened a cut. But in all his fights, there are moments where he runs in throwing punches, the opponent stops to counter, and they just collide. And then Du Plessis drops on the hips or grabs the clinch or something like that. And it's a form of punch and clutch where he just runs through the person. And it's really quite impressive. It's also how he gets into those grappling exchanges that he does so well in. So those two things really help. He does have, one of the things that he does constantly is kick the legs. He's really big on low kicking. You don't tend to notice it because you're waiting for the big swings, but consistently throughout fights, there isn't sort of like a 30-second period that goes by where he hasn't thrown 2 or 3 low kicks. And he does a great step-up lead leg low kick off both legs. So because he's switching stances constantly, against a fighter in the same stance as him, so a closed guard engagement, closed stance engagement. Let's say he's orthodox and the opponent's orthodox. He uses the step-up inside low kick inside their lead leg to set up his right hand or just chop at them. But a lot of times he comes in with his right hand off it. But if they're southpaw and he's left leg forward, so an open stance engagement, he does a lot of chopping to the lead leg and he goes below the knee, which is lead leg calf kicking. I'm always saying not enough people good at it. And he can do it off both sides, which really helps him. But one of the interesting things is, do you remember I've always said about Robert Whitaker, he's 70% technical fighting, 30% swinging like a lunatic. Dricus Du Plessis is like that, but reversed. He's about 70% swinging like a lunatic, 30% technical fighting. So if you watch his fight with Derek Brunson, there'll be moments where just stuff that he's clearly spotted slips in. So he's been doing the running flurries, and then he's running backwards when Brunson's flurrying at him, exactly like you'd expect if you said those two names in a fight. You know, just both running forward with their chin up and then running backwards with their guard up. And then he switches to southpaw, starts pressuring in on Brunson, does a double jab, and as Brunson ducks down, he throws a perfect rear hand left hook down at where Brunson's ducking. And he did it so quickly that he had to know that Brunson did that. He had to know that Brunson's constantly ducking. If you watch his fight with Marcus Perez does a spinning elbow and he knocks him out with the left hook in the same position as Marcus Perez is leaning over. And then in that Brunson fight, he switches back to orthodox and he does another double jab and digs a body shot. And it's like he's starting to pressure him down and stand on top of him. And it's so strange because so much of the running in and out is typically because fighters don't feel comfortable standing close to people. in MMA. You know, whether that's because they're scared of the takedown or scared of the strikes. It works both ways. You've got strikers who are scared of the takedown, so they're trying to like run from out of range and then run back out to long range. And you've got grapplers who are scared to engage in striking contests, so they're running in and out with their punches too. So there's weird moments like that, but the stuff that you would expect to work against him still sort of works, like Tavares dropping and popping him with the counter right hand. He got stuck on the end of Darren Till's straight punches for most of round 2 and much of round 3. But then he fought Robert Whittaker, and I think one of the things about the Whittaker fight that's so interesting is that he spends, aside from chopping the legs, he's sort of waiting on the counter. And when you watch him on the lead, which he is most of the time, there's a big telegraph on almost everything he does. His shoulders and his chin comes up and his shoulders start loading whatever he's about to throw. He's normally wading forward, so he takes a big step with his lead foot first. Whereas when he's fighting Whittaker, he's looking for that jab. He's trying to beat him to the jab. When he's southpaw, and this is a great thing about Whittaker's, Du Plessis switch hitting. He's normally orthodox, switches to southpaw. And he says that he spotted Whittaker's hands coming from very low and him getting caught with the counter jab when he's entering against an open stance. And he does it. Like, he stands there and he waits for him and he hits him with this southpaw jab. And, I didn't spot it before the fight, but he said he'd spotted it and then he did it in the fight. So it must be that. He did it several times, didn't he? But you can see he's a lot less easy to read when he's just waiting on the opponent. And he doesn't do that a lot. He doesn't counterfight an awful lot. So that's intriguing. But the other thing that I saw he had trouble with, being put on the back foot, because a lot of you'll see him in fights, he backs onto the fence, he keeps his guard. In the first part of a fight, he fights like I spar when I'm like, oh, I'm an old man and I actually can't see things coming anymore. His hands are all the way up. He's very tense. And that makes it even easier to see when he's going to start punching. You as an outside observer can watch it. Because we talked about this with Sugar Ray Robinson before. Like, if your hands are slightly lower and pointing at the opponent, it's a lot harder for them to see, because the thing is, like, your hand is growing bigger towards their face. That's the tell. Whereas if your hands are pointing upwards and then you start pointing them towards the guy as you're throwing the punch, it's a lot easier to see. So a high guard can often make it hard to sneak punches in on someone with speed. But he does this thing where he like backs onto the fence and he bounces off it like a pro wrestler. And against Trevin Giles, he knocked him out off that. But he was trying it against Darren Till and getting jabbed. And he even tried like a Superman punch off the cage against Till. I do like the Superman punch off the cage. I think it's a pretty cool move, an idea. I always shout out Josh Berkman versus Hector Lombard for this one, because Hector Lombard, much better striker than Josh Berkman, much harder hitter than Josh Berkman. He's walking Berkman down, and for about 2 and a bit rounds, maybe it's 1 and a bit rounds, I forget, but Berkman just keeps like getting pushed to the fence, and then he does the Superman punch, comes in real high over Hector Lombard's guard, and Lombard has to back off and let him come back to the middle of the cage. It's really interesting how much it threw him off. But yes, that is to say, Dricus Du Plessis on the back foot, I think if he gets put on the back foot here and he doesn't grapple, he doesn't engage in a clinch, he's going to have a very hard time. Because Sean Strickland, look at the fight with Israel Adesanya, which is basically like my go-to for Sean Strickland now, because I think a lot of that matchup was to do with the styles, as it often is, but Izzy's best weapons are straight hitting and kicks, low kicks particularly, and front kicks to the body. But straight hitting is what gets his plums, if you will. He has 3 knockouts by left hook in high-profile fights, but if you watch those knockouts, because I've said this before, I said I don't like Izzy's left hook, and people were like, he knocked out Costa, Whittaker, and then someone else. But if you watch his left hook, it's a big load-up, and then it's his whole body, and he swings across himself, and he's out of position afterwards. And the big load-up is the main thing. Like, he has to set his feet, he has to stand wider than usual normally, just wind his shoulders up and then throw it, because he fights quite bladed a lot of the time. It's also quite like wooden compared to his other punches. It's the same way that like his overhand is not really an overhand. It's sort of like it extends from the elbow as he's throwing it. It's not a big swing. It's more like an arcing punch, an arcing straight. But yeah, that left hook is what he grit his teeth against the fence and tried it against Strickland, and Strickland shot down the inside because Strickland was throwing straight. So most of Israel Adesanya's stuff is throwing straight, and that is what Strickland's actually pretty good at dealing with, because he's always reaching and parrying and leaning back, And those things will get you murdered if the guy's doing good things where he's coming around the side. He's getting you engaged on the center line and then catching you around your reach, like Pereira did in their fight, but Izzy wasn't really doing that. Now, Dricus Du Plessis, he has good hooks, and I'm sure he'll have watched the Pereira fight and be planning on throwing some hooks around Strickland's reaches. But a lot of his punching is straight, normally from the chest. It's not like good boxing straights. He goes from the very high guard to dropping his hands and throwing straight. But that's one element of it. The other element is that he doesn't like being backed up. The other element is that he doesn't like body shots, and particularly front kicks to the body. Brunson, Giles, I think it was just those two. They both, really backed him up with front kicks to the body.
A few moments later.
I've been watching the Du Plessis, when he ran through that team of Gracie Barra guys in a quintet style event. He beat the whole team just on his own. But his grappling's quite interesting because top position, he likes to mog people from half guard, which is quite traditional. If you watch the Rob Whittaker fight, he did that. Rob Whittaker came up on the underhook and he went overhook all the way down to palm underneath Whittaker's bottom leg, which is something that Neil Melanson used to teach the Black Zillions and people like that, and tips him down onto his shoulder again because you don't want them getting up on their elbow. And what Du Plessis was able to do was threaten the D'Arce, and then when Whittaker straightened his back to keep himself out of the D'Arce, you want to crumple a guy up to get a D'Arce. When Whittaker straightened his back out, he'd drop an elbow on him. And then the instinct when you get an elbow dropped onto you is to try and get your head back into the guy's chest so he can't elbow you. So you can keep him in that sort of little spiral of one thing playing into the other. Double attack, that's what we sometimes call that. Elbows and D'Arces. But one of the moves that he used against Whittaker, which I then saw him use in the Gracie Barra match, or the quintet match, and also I watched him do it against Trevin Giles when Trevin Giles was threatening an armbar, was something called the Sao Paulo pass or the Tozy pass. It used to be a common style of passing in Sao Paulo, apparently, but it was also popularized by this guy called Roberto Tozy. There's a few variations of it. Like, the idea, it basically is any pass where you break the closed guard by staying chest to chest with the guy with an underhook, and it goes against the rules of what you traditionally do in closed guard. You want to posture, you want to stand up so that they're carrying the weight of themselves on their ankles, and then you either, in MMA you drop punches on them, or their legs normally just come apart. They try and double ankle you and you lift one leg out. That's the Marcelo method. Once you learn that, you're much less scared of getting stuck in closed guard. Stand up when they grab your ankles, lift one out. That's literally, Marcelo Garcia was wrecking people with that when they tried to keep him in closed guard. They're like, oh my God, I can't believe he just stands without holding one of my arms, so I can't do the double ankle sweep. But the Tozy pass is like counter to that. You stay low and you put one hand on the mat, which is anti-jiu-jitsu basics. One of the first things you learn in closed guard, whether it's gi or no gi, don't put your hands on the motherfucking mat, because that means they wrap it with an overhook. And if they're good at playing some kind of climbing guard where they jump to a triangle or an omoplata, you've got problems. And also, you just had to, if you're going to break the guard by standing and posturing and starting passing that way, you've got more work to do to get from there. You can't really hit them effectively from hands on the mat either. Hands on the mat, first thing you learn not to do. Tozy pass, you give them the overhook. You take an underhook. And then there's a few variations where you switch the hips and you try and break their ankles apart with your hand. So if you watch Wilson Hayes, he did this in Bellator in MMA, but he used to do it against really good grapplers. He did it to Ryan Hall in one of their great, I think it's Grapplers Quest matches. If you go watch those, he does it a couple of times. He gets the underhook, switches his hips, reaches back, and then uses one of his hips to unbuckle Ryan Hall's guard, and then steps over into like a half guard. And that's the value of it. You stay close, and you step over to half guard, and you start the murderous half guard sequence passing that basically rules MMA and no-gi. But the Tozy stack is what Dricus Du Plessis does, which is where you get the underhook, you normally put a hand over their other shoulder, and you keep your head low, and then you pop your hips up into a tripod and walk around them, trying to walk their knee up to their nose, sideways. And then the arm that's not underhooking, you throw it over their head and pull their head into their knee. And it's a can opener with more steps, is basically what it is. But it's legal in competition jiu-jitsu. And it is it's murderous. If you watch it when he does it to Robert Whittaker, he crumples him up into a ball. And basically, because Robert Whittaker, his knee gets up next to his head, so he has to open his guard to relieve pressure on his legs. and on his back and everything. And then once you do open your legs up by your head, so you can't really do anything with it. And Du Plessis just steps over it into half guard and starts elbowing him. It's a very cool technique. And then if you watch the Trevin Giles fight, Trevin Giles starts throwing up an armbar. Du Plessis starts stacking him, punches the arm through into an underhook once he's got some room, and then continues doing the toesy stack and then just stands out of it. It's a really cool technique, and it might not catch on in a big way because it is kind of a strongman technique, but it's just another one of those quirks that makes people so cool. You know, you could train in like 4 different gyms, and there might not be one good person at the toesy stack to train for. You know, to train for this against Dricus Du Plessis. Other quirks I noted about his grappling: when he gets pulled into leg entanglements a lot, because he's in half guard, guys will throw that reap. Not quite like Pantoja, because they're not freaks. They can't just unhook their hips at the hip joint and throw their legs however they want. But guys will slightly bump him or elevate him and then throw the leg over and start attacking an outside heel hook. And his answer to that is to leave himself in the outside heel hook and grab a toe hold. And that's real strongmanning jiu-jitsu. That's sketchy stuff. You know, you could get your knee blown apart. But clearly he goes for it with such aggression that people give up on the heel hook. If you watch, he does it against Brunson, he does it against Till, he does it in this grappling contest too. Guys get him into the same position every single time. He jumps on a toe hold, and then they let go and they have to like roll so that he won't break their foot off. But a lot of it's like there's those cool elements that he's clearly worked on, and there's also some weird stuff in there. If you watch his